Good morning. Have you ever felt overwhelmed? I mean, like overwhelmed and sometimes to the point of freeze, right? That was me about an hour ago. Yeah. I owe an apology to the 8 o'clock folks at 8 o'clock. What wasn't good. And I stumbled over my words, and I was stumbling through what was going on and trying to keep my focus on the sermon going in. And what the people in the front couple of rows knew is that my shoelace had come untied. And everybody in the front couple of rows, I could tell for the comments after the sermon, that's the only thing they were watching is... A couple of people said, we were praying for you that you didn't do the shoelace catch and face plant on the concrete. And on top of that, in here, I get to follow this guy, a guy who has a way of just talking and making things plain and understood off the cuff. And I'm a guy, by now, if you haven't figured out, I have to fight for every word that comes out. It's that overwhelmed, right? And how are we going to do this? And we're going to get there, but hang on. Because that's the story of our Joshua this morning that we're going to talk about. But I got to catch you up before we can deal with that. I got to catch you up into the story. Because the story picks up last week. We're going to pick it up last week. Is Yahweh has fulfilled one of his promises to his people. He said he was going to bring his people out of Egypt, and we saw that last week. He did that. Brought the children of Abraham to Mount Sinai, where he gathered them around Mount Sinai. And Moses went up to the top of Mount Sinai, and Yahweh spoke to Moses, and Yahweh spoke to his people in that, what we call the Sinai covenant. You have to remember that, but Sinai covenant. He comes in and he says to them, I am Yahweh your God. He says who he is. He identifies himself, gives his personal name. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. In other words, what he's done, and he says, you shall have no other gods before me. Basically, what Yahweh did right here is Yahweh defined worship. And with this, remember from Genesis chapter 1, God's purpose for human beings, his creation, his first purpose is that we worship him. Yahweh in this passage has defined what worship means. It means it's Yahweh our God, God who brings us out of slavery, and we have no other gods, and on down through the Ten Commandments. And the people of Israel got that. Children of Abraham understood that, and one voice, they said, yes, we promise, we'll do this. We'll fulfill this promise and do this. And then it didn't take long for them to break the promise. They came in and they made a golden calf, and they said, okay, Yahweh, we're going to worship this. And despite their unfaithfulness, despite their mess, despite the train wreck they make of their lives, Yahweh is faithful to his promises. Yahweh is faithful to his promises. And they spend 2 years at Mount Sinai, and in 2 years, Yahweh teaches them what it means to be a people of God. He teaches them what it means to be a family, what it means to be a worshiping community, what it means to follow him. And after 2 years, it says, okay, it's time to go. And they pack up and they leave, and they start going to the promised land. And they're gone from Mount Sinai 3 days. 3 days, in a story that's incredibly similar to what happened at the Red Sea. 3 days after they leave, they start grumbling about the food. We have no food. We don't have anything to eat. We don't have anything to drink. They go on a little bit further, and this time Miriam and Aaron. Miriam and Aaron are Moses' brother and sister, who one of his right-hand men, woman here, assisting him in all that he does. Miriam and Aaron try to stage a coup d'etat. And Yahweh's not having any part of that. And they come to the edge of the promised land for the first time. And they decide that what they need to do is they need to send out spies into the promised land to see what the land is like, to scope it out and see what's going on. They send out 12 spies into the promised land, and they look around and they see it, and they come back. And 10 of the spies report, we can't do this. The people are too big. The cities are too strong. It's too populated. We just can't do this in here. In short, what it has is coming in, as they reported back, says we can't trust the promises of God. And so Yahweh says, okay, I'm cool. It's going to cost you 40 years in the wilderness, but I'm good. So they wandered for 40 years. 40 years about grumbling about the food, 40 years of grumbling about the water, 40 years of grumbling about the leadership, a couple more attempts at a coup d'etat against Moses, 40 years of occasionally finding a false god to worship, 40 years of finding a Baal to go out and worship in here. And after 40 years of wandering and Yahweh leading them, Yahweh has brought them again the second time to the edge of the promised land. They are literally across the Jordan River from the promised land. They can stand at the Jordan River on one bank and look over and see it. Now, if you want to picture in your mind what that's kind of look like in the distances, don't think Mississippi River, think Current River. Think Current River, right? That's kind of the distance over there. They can stand, they can look, and they can see it. And it's coming back and sitting here saying, okay, it's time. Yahweh is going to fulfill one of his promises. One of those promises that he made 600 years earlier. 600 years to a guy by the name of Abram. Made 3 promises to Abram. Number 1, we're going to give you this land that you're dwelling in. Number 2, I'm going to make you a great nation. Number 3, all nations of the earth will be blessed through you. All nations of the earth will be blessed through you is coming. When the nation is established, when Jesus comes into the picture and through us, ultimately, all nations of the earth are going to be blessed. The second one, make you a great nation. It started off, it was just Abraham and Sarah, and through God's providence and God fulfilling his promise, there was Isaac, Jacob, and it turns now into millions of people that are waiting there to cross the promised land. Now this great nation from Abraham. The first one is this land. And he says, now it's time. I'm going to give you this land. But it's not going to involve Moses. Moses, you're not there. And partly because Moses rebelled too. Moses messed up. Moses was a mess as well. And Moses doesn't follow God's instructions and he strikes rock when he's supposed to speak to it. And it's a cool story in there. But it's otherwise, but also in here, because that's not Moses' job. Moses' job, the role that God had selected Moses for, was to be fulfilling this promise that Yahweh made to lead the people out of Egypt. That's the promise that Yahweh used Moses to fulfill, to lead the people out of Egypt. And he's done that. And he's led them through the wilderness and led them to the edge of the promised land. And now Yahweh says, Moses, your job is done. You're through. Thank you very much, good and faithful servant. He takes him up on a high mountain and he shows him the promised land, shows him what he can't go in to see. But Moses gets to see it before anybody else does. And then it says Moses goes up to the top of this mountain. He's on the top of this mountain and Moses dies. And how's this for status? It says Yahweh himself buries Moses. And now it's Joshua's turn. Joshua's been Moses' aide for these 40 years. Joshua, who's been a commander in the armies. Joshua, who's done all kinds of different stuff. Joshua, this right-hand guy, Joshua the associate here, right? It's now Joshua's turn. Have you ever tried to follow a legend? Ever thought about that? What it's like to follow somebody who's larger than life? Whose status is just up here that everybody looks up to? That's what Joshua got to do. Give you a comparison here is that several years ago, NBC did a live performance on television, a live performance of Sound of Music. Anybody remember that? Going in, watched it, right? They selected a young lady by the name of Carrie Underwood to sing the role of Maria. Carrie Underwood's a beautiful girl, and she was okay in acting. In here, she's got a beautiful voice going in. and you watch the performance, and they do okay. You know, it's not Broadway, it's not spectacular, but it's good, it's all right. But I remember watching social media as it's taking place, and watching social media as it's afterwards, and watching all the comments. You know what the one comment was? Well, Carrie Underwood's not Julie Andrews. And I was thinking, duh. Who is, right? Julie Andrews is the legend. It can be hard following a legend. It can be hard following somebody who's larger than life. Listen to how Moses is described in the book of Deuteronomy. It says, "And there has not arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Now get your hands around that for a second. That Yahweh talked to Moses like you and I would sit here and talk over a cup of coffee. That Yahweh knew face to face, none like him, for all the signs and wonders that Yahweh sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and for all the mighty power of all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. You catch this? Old Testament, there's a prophet by the name of Moses. The next prophet that they compare to Moses is Jesus. That's pretty good company. That's pretty tough to follow. And so Moses is there, and Joshua is there now, and Joshua is the new head of the people. Joshua is the leader of the people, this nation, this political entity, these people moving in here. Joshua is the head of these people, and Joshua is the head of the army that Yahweh's going to lead, but Joshua is the captain of the army that's leading in and conquer the promised land. And Yahweh now, oh, by the way, he is the spokesman for Yahweh to convey what Yahweh's saying to his people. And if that's not good enough, everything he does, they sit here and say, Moses didn't do it that way. Everything he does, it gets compared to Moses. And you can't help it, but he felt overwhelmed. This incredibly mountainous job that he had. So I go back. Have you ever felt uncomfortable? Ever felt overwhelmed? Ever felt this task of being in mission and living out this grace that God gives us? You ever felt overwhelmed about it? Ever sat there and looked yourself in the mirror in the morning and one of those moments of realization through the fog of early morning hits you and you go, how in the world am I going to do this today? Ever walks in here and sits here, oh, what's this joining Jesus thing all about? How do I join Jesus? How do I get out of my comfort zone? How do I stretch myself? I want to do something, but I don't know how. I want to do something, but I'm afraid. How do I do these things? I know you have because you've told me. It's this being overwhelmed. So it's not an accident in the story of Joshua that Yahweh speaks to Joshua and he says this. We find it in verse 9. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not be frightened, do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Did you catch it? Whose confirmation verse is it? Yeah. There's 3 or 4 of my confirmation kids this year have selected this one for their confirmation verse, right? Hear it again. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not be frightened, do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Yahweh says this to Joshua. He doesn't tell Joshua this once. He doesn't tell Joshua this twice. He tells Joshua this 6 times. 6 times, Yahweh says to Joshua, be strong and courageous and do not be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. To get it in his head, for him to have this assurance. This is one of those promises that God makes. He says, be strong and courageous. I am with you wherever you go. Sometimes we sit here and we read Matthew chapter 28. It says, Jesus says, lo, I am with you always to the very end of the age. And think, that's a cool Jesus statement. Isn't that fun? Guess where Jesus got it? Got it from his Father. It started in Joshua. Actually started before that, but that's a different sermon. But it comes in and it says, Yahweh's going to be with you. In the face of the overwhelming, in the face of I don't know how to do this, in the face of what's going on in the world, in the face of even standing up in front of you all, I know you love each other and you're supporting me, but I tell you, friends, some days it's overwhelming to stand here. The Lord your God is with you wherever you go. That's exactly what Pastor John told me after the 8 o'clock service. Came up as he does, right? He doesn't say for you, The Lord your God is with you wherever you go. In the face of the overwhelming, in the face when we struggle in here, the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So Joshua takes command of the armies. See, the intersection of God fulfilling his promises and God using his creation right here falls at a guy by the name of Joshua. God makes a promise that he's going to give the land. God uses his creation to accomplish his purposes in the world. It intersects right here at a guy by the name of Joshua. And I could sit here and I could tell you there's 7 years. I could tell you 7 years of stories of them, of the people of Israel, Abraham's children, the people of his promise, when they were on the promise, where they did great and when they failed. I could tell you about victories. I could tell you about defeats. I could tell you about them following Yahweh. I could tell you about them following the Baals. I could tell you about them being cheated. I could tell you about them being faithful. I could tell you about them being unfaithful. I could tell you about them feeling overwhelmed at every turn. But in the end, Yahweh gives them the land. Joshua 21 says, "Thus Yahweh gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Yahweh gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers." Yahweh keeps his word. Yahweh makes a promise to his people, and he keeps his word. He made a promise to them that he would bring them out of Egypt, and he kept his word. He made a promise that he would be with them and give them this land, and he keeps his word. Yahweh keeps his word. And despite our failures, and despite our fears, and despite the train wrecks we make of our life, it doesn't depend, him keeping his word doesn't depend upon us. It doesn't depend on how wonderful we are. It doesn't depend on how great we are, how wonderful you are, how wonderful you sing, or any of those things. It doesn't depend on those things. Yahweh keeping his word, he keeps his word. That's who he is. And that's how he deals with us. He keeps his word. So you want to hear the last part of this story? About 1,400 years later, another Joshua arrives on the scene. This Joshua is the intersection of God fulfilling his promises and God using his creation. In this New Testament Joshua, you see him leading his people. You see him gathering his people around him. You see him healing people. You see him sharing the love of God. You see him raising people from the dead. You see him being crucified, showing them what love is. You see him being raised from the dead to show God keeping his promise to his people. You caught it yet? It's Jesus. The word Jesus in the New Testament and the word Joshua in the Old Testament is exactly the same word. Yahweh uses Joshua to fulfill his promises. He used Joshua in the Old Testament to fulfill his promise to give them this land. He uses Joshua in the New Testament to the promise that he makes to you that he's going to bring you back, to redeem and restore you and bring you back to him. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we give you thanks this day that you do fulfill your promises, and when we feel overwhelmed and when we feel surrounded and we feel swamped, help us to go back to those promises you make that you will be with us wherever we go. Fill us with that, and fill us with your grace, and fill us with your love, that you use us. Not only feed us and promise to us, but you promise to be with us as you use us to heal your creation. Amen.